Hey everyone, this is Martin Willis, and welcome to the Everything Else show. Tonight we have Stan Gordon on. It's going to be interesting. We're going to be talking about Bigfoot and all kinds of other interesting cryptids that have been sighted in Pennsylvania. Should be an interesting show. And a lot of times, people say, why isn't there any body of a Bigfoot found? Or, why isn't there more evidence? And we're going to be discussing that and a heck of a lot more this evening. And I'll bring on our guest who is on the phone. I'm talking to him on the phone in Pennsylvania. Stan, how you doing?
We're doing very good. Thanks very much, Martin.
Yeah. So thanks. We've talked a number of times in the past, had some great conversations, but tonight we're talking Bigfoot and we're talking cryptids and weird animal sightings in Pennsylvania. And before we get started into any stories or anything like that, is it also neighboring states, or is it? I know that's you're dealing in just Pennsylvania, but are neighboring states as active as Pennsylvania?
Well, there's always been a lot of history in, for example, Ohio, West Virginia's got a lot of history going back many years, going back to the Mothman back in 1966. And a lot of surrounding states, do have quite a bit of activity. Pennsylvania has always been historically very active with these strange reports. I mean, there's accounts going back to the Native Americans. There were newspaper accounts in the 1800s that talked about Bigfoot encounters and people finding large tracks in the woods. So it's been going on for a long time. It is always very active year after year here in Pennsylvania. Reports come in here of all kind of phenomena, a lot of UFO reports, but again, we also get cryptid reports coming in every year. And we've even heard some reports we're following up on just in the last couple of weeks that we have some information on. We're trying to follow up and trying to locate witnesses. So it goes on year after year. You also got to remember, though, that my first group originated back in 1970, the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group, and the group was kind of unique in that it was mainly scientists, engineers, technicians, specialists. We had police officers, we had former military intelligence people, we had all kinds of science. We had physicists and anthropologists and forensic people, and we were kind of a unique group, and we all did this around our regular jobs. But I had it set up that we started locally small in the Pittsburgh area. But again, by 1973, it expanded to cover the whole state of Pennsylvania. And to our surprise, we began to get referrals, for example, from the news media, from the state police. And so we were getting a lot of reports to investigate. So my hotline started in 1969. It's been active ever since 1969. Wow. So it was one of the only places in the country that you could call and somebody would actually talk to you, and there would be people who would go out and investigate the cases, which is also another reason why there may be more reports here, because there was a place where people could actually report what they were encountering.
Wow. Amazing. Now, so why do you think Pennsylvania? Why do you think it's so active there? Any thoughts on that?
There's different theories, and of course, there's a huge amount of forest area and woodland, streams and creeks and mountainous areas. There's a lot of places for animals to hide, and hunters have reported seeing strange creatures in the woods around here for years and years. So, the terrain is very, very capable of having these type of things being reported. And but once again, having had contact with researchers around the country for many, many years, these things go on everywhere, but you just don't hear about it that much. And as we get into it, I'm sure you're going to hear some very strange accounts tonight. Probably some things people never even heard of before. And, I will tell you right from the beginning, and this is almost 58 years now I've been doing this research. I have never personally seen a Bigfoot or UFO myself. I've interviewed thousands of UFO witnesses, hundreds of cryptid witnesses. I've seen a lot of evidence, but I've never had a personal encounter.
Wow. Okay. Now, so you started this call-in line in 1969. How did people first, that was way, way before the internet. And how did people first hear about that? Did you share that with, say, sheriff's departments and things like that?
Well, yeah, how I got involved, I was a youngster. I was 10 years old in 1959 when I started on this. And people always ask me, how did you get involved at such a young age? Well, my birthday, coincidentally, was during the Halloween season, and my parents gave me, as a birthday gift, a AM radio. And I was tuning around on the AM radio, and because of Halloween, there were some radio shows talking about haunted houses and ghosts and flying saucers and strange creatures, and I was a curious 10-year-old, and I wanted to know if these people were making these stories up, so I began to frequent the local library, and I began to read all the books they had and began to cut articles out, make scrapbooks. And if something would appear in our local papers, if somebody claimed they saw something, I called them on the phone, I interviewed them, I kept records of it. That's how it all started for me. 1965, the incident happened near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, about 12 miles from where I live. I started documenting that information that night as it was breaking on the news, and now, 50-some years later, I'm still getting information on the case. Well, I began to go out into the field to investigate cases after Kecksburg, and I got involved with a group in Pittsburgh. It was called UFO Research Institute. It was a small group of Westinghouse scientists and engineers, and that's where Stanton Friedman began. So Stanton was just getting into the field. I had already been in it pretty actively, so I became the young researcher of their group, and I became a telephone sighting coordinator. So when they would get a report, the report would initially come to me. I would interview the people and determine if the case warranted further research. And I stayed with them until they shut down their operation. So in 1969, I decided to set up my own hotline, and I began to make contact with the local news media and the police departments around here, told them what I was doing. And back in those days, there was a lot more ridicule than there is today. Yeah. And but I handled it very seriously, and I told the different officers, and I really didn't have a lot of ridicule, as I recall. A lot of them took it pretty serious, and I told them, look, if you get any calls, even if you're not going to investigate them, if you at least let the people know that there's somebody they can call, they can discuss the subject with, give them my phone number. Well, within weeks after my phone number started circulating out there and it began to show up in the local newspapers and people were talking about it, the phone in my house was ringing off the hook day and night. And I was getting calls from people who had seen everything from ghosts to claim they lived in haunted houses, UFOs, Bigfoot, strange creatures, all kind of weird things going on. It became obvious to me this was a lot more than I could handle on my own. And that's when I decided to organize a volunteer research group of people to go out to investigate reports, and that's how it all began.
Wow. So you started that young. And now, have you actually gone to, say, a Bigfoot sighting and seen the tracks that?
Oh my gosh!
Many.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, a question I always had on that: when someone finds tracks, these Bigfoot tracks, how well do you study where the origination and the direction, and how far it trails off until you can't see them anymore?
It all depends on the situation, and we'll get into some of the odd events that showed up, which began to change my opinion of what we might be dealing with over the years. But in a lot of cases, we did. Sometimes you had tracks in snow. Sometimes you had tracks in mud and different type of ground conditions. Sometimes there was only a partial track. Sometimes there was a series of tracks. Sometimes there was a long series of tracks. And so it was different conditions. And you got to remember, again, we had police officers. We had people who were familiar with this type of investigation. We had an anthropologist in the group. And it was very easy to determine if the tracks were fabricated. And very rarely did you have hoax-type tracks. Mainly, for example, back when we had the massive outbreak we'll talk about in 1973 and 74, and as time went on, that began to hit the local news and made the statewide and the national news, our investigations. Well, yes, you had a few hoax cases, but it was very easy to determine the difference in the tracks. For example, it was not just the huge stride of the tracks and the depth of the tracks, but you could also see how the difference in the measurements of the toes, how they spread differently. Some of them, the tracks, you could actually see like the weight distribution. The bone structure was so good, actually, in a couple of the tracks. And so they were very, very intriguing. But to add to the mystery, which we'll get into a lot of the mystery, you had your typical five-toed footprints, which is common to most of the Bigfoot sightings throughout the country and in some other parts of the world. But back in 73 and 74, and occasionally since that time, in Pennsylvania and many other states, you were also getting reports of three-toed footprints showing up, and then even sometimes four-toed. And a lot of people don't know it, but out in the Pacific Northwest and Canada and other areas where there's a lot of Bigfoot activity historically, they had both five-toed and three-toed tracks showing up going back to at least the 1970s. And it just adds more and more to the mystery as to what we're dealing with.
Wow, interesting. Now, okay, so this is we'll get back into talking more about this, but one of the things I was thinking about in your careers or career, whatever it is that you have in life, have you ever had to deal with ridicule about your work with any of this?
Actually, surprisingly, I always try to handle this very seriously, very objectively, very open-mindedly, but skeptical. And I can tell you, a lot of the research people and scientists that got involved in my group, a lot of these people worked, for example, for Westinghouse, for Gulf Research, or Alcoa in Pittsburgh area. Many of these people and police officers, for example, worked with me anonymously because of their positions. And many of those fellows, men and women both, spent months and years out in the field with me, came in skeptical, but over a long period of time, as they began to go out to different incidents, they began to interview a lot of witnesses. They began to see the similarities in the reports. They began to see the similarities in the tracks. They would notice, for example, the animal reactions, which we'll talk about, which could not have been fabricated. They began to realize that, there's something going on here we just don't have an explanation for. And, but, I started, when I was in high school, I was talking about these subjects. I would write papers about it. It was probably even in high school or soon after that I began to give public lectures at different organizations about UFOs and Bigfoot. And people around here were taking it very seriously. And a lot of the people in the media and a lot of the police departments around here, they knew what our group was about. They knew what we were doing this very scientifically with what we had. Of course, we were doing this out of our own pockets. But we had, we built some of our own equipment. We had access to some good equipment during that time period. And they knew that our position was to go out and try to find an explanation for any of these events before we say something is unexplainable. And that's what we always did. So many UFO sightings are misidentifications. Even with Bigfoot, for example, some Bigfoot were determined to be bear, some were determined to be very large, shaggy dogs, some were hunters in camouflage outfits. So there were different things that we could explain. And many reports of phenomena ongoing, all the time coming in. A lot of reports initially sound strange and unusual, but when you take the time to properly investigate them, many are determined to be either natural or man-made in origin. But year after year, there are incidents occurring you cannot dismiss away so easily.
Right. Getting back to the tracks, we'll bounce back to that. There's a question that came in the chat room asking, has any of the tracks that you've investigated disappeared without a natural explanation, either in the snow or the mud or something like that?
Yep, and that's what we'll get into. Yes, indeed. Okay. That was one of the first things that began to come to our attention, that began to make us scratch our heads as to what we're dealing with. So I've got to go back a little bit in history, back to this wave of 73 and 74, because some of the most amazing cases with Bigfoot and other phenomena occurred during that time period, and that's why I wrote about my Silent Invasion book. It just was the most amazing series of events to live through in 1973 to 1974.
Okay.
So this will take a little bit of time. Just to tell you how this all began. This is in western Pennsylvania where it began, probably about 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh in Westmoreland County where I live. And it all started back in 73 when I got a phone call from a relative of a person who had an odd experience on July 31st of that year in a rural area by the old Green Gate Mall, which is no longer there. There was a lot of woods and brush around there at the time, and it was a warm night. This fellow was in the bathroom shaving because he got up early for work, began to sniffle, began to smell this funny odor, he said, like rotten cucumber, turned around to look at the bathroom window, which the window was up and the screen was in, and here's these two huge glowing red eyes staring at him. The window's 8 feet off the ground. So he ran into the room and started yelling. Some of the other relatives came out. They smelled the odor, but whatever was in the window was gone. There were dogs outside, but none of them were barking, which they thought that's highly unusual because they always bark if there's anybody around that they're not familiar with. Anyhow, the fellow had some physical problems, possibly as a result of this, went to the hospital, got out a week later. On August 7th, I went out that Sunday to interview him when he got home. Guy was still pretty shook up, gave me a detailed account of what he saw. Found out that several weeks before, some local boys had taken a shortcut towards the mall through the woods, and they heard some commotion in there, and they figured it was a deer. So they began to throw some rocks and pebbles in to scare the deer out. But to their surprise, here comes this 7 to 8 foot tall, man-like creature with long hair on it and very long arms swinging, crossing the road, going up behind the house. So that day I was able to interview several of those boys, and I got permission to go up to look around on their property. And we're out there for a while looking around. And I remember up on that hillside, the ground was not real conducive for tracks, and I was about ready to call it over for the day when I happened to look down, and as I recall, there was a partial track, and there was another completely detailed track in front of me, something I had never seen before. And the kids came over, and they started yelling, what kind of animal can make a track like that? It was 13 inches long, 8 inches wide, but clearly three-toed. Wow. So I got on the radio, one of my other helpers came out. We took photographs and measurements and made a casting. And while we're out there, we get a radio call that one of our field investigators north of Pittsburgh, almost the Ohio line that morning, was investigating a case where something 9 foot tall had looked into a window, and police found large footprints up in the area. Well, this began this major wave of Bigfoot activity that would go on for weeks and months into 1974. It started out first in southwest Pennsylvania, but then it began to spread to other parts of the state. And it was amazing, the multitudes of Bigfoot sightings coming in from widespread areas, all hours of the day and night, many sightings in daylight. Many sightings where these things were extremely close range. We're talking 5, 10, 15 feet away from people. Generally where they walked out in front of vehicles, they were in rural areas, they walked out by mobile homes, people looking out the windows of their homes and they see them. And in some cases, there were multiple creatures together, like 2 or 3 together at the same time. And in many of those cases, the people were very shook up, and they were calling the police. And then we would get the calls. Now, back in those days, the police, local and even state police, would respond to some of these incidents. In other cases, they would call my team out, and we would get out there, and sometimes we would both be on the scene. So we were getting there within minutes to hours after these things occurred, which is why we could document these cases so quickly and well document these cases for later study. And so these reports went on and on and on. And the question somebody brought up recently, as you mentioned, was about the tracks. Well, you know, as all these reports are continuing going on, you know, initially, just from my experience out in the field, because I began to investigate Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania in the late 1960s. And I always felt that from what we knew about the Bigfoot reports, that if they were real, and I had interviewed some people up to that point that seemed very credible, that these things were probably an unknown type of animal, something that science had not yet been able to confirm. But as these reports continued, various strange details began to come to our attention. One of them was, for example, some of our teams would get out to certain locations, and there would be trails of footprints that would just suddenly stop and disappear when there should have been more tracks. That's something that was just very, very unusual. And these were different witnesses bringing it up, and also our teams out there and seeing this. And there were cases even in snow where they would just, and even in recent years, I can tell you, where there was a heavy snow, no other tracks around, these deep, large footprints in the snow that would just suddenly stop and vanish. That's something that began to make us scratch our heads. And then other things began to come up. I remember one case during '73. A lot of this was occurring in across the state, as I was saying, but there were certain areas where we were getting more reports than others. One area, and you'll hear me talk about this quite a bit, was along the Chestnut Ridge. So the Chestnut Ridge is a mountain range that extends 100 miles long from Preston County, West Virginia, to Westmoreland, Fayette, Indiana County. So here in Westmoreland County, outside of the city of Latrobe, going over to the Dairy side of the ridge, going up towards Indiana, and then on the opposite side of the ridge, going over to Youngstown Ridge and Bagley, there were many, many Bigfoot reports going on. And interestingly, even today, in recent years and years past, we get almost yearly Bigfoot and other cryptid sightings reported all along that part of the Chestnut Ridge from different people. And so there was a lot of that activity going on. In one case, and I recall, a man, I believe his wife, were riding down the road one day, and he went in and notified the local police about this, too. And he said he was riding down the road, and all of a sudden this very tall, hairy creature walked out right in front of their vehicle, and he said he hit the creature with his car, and it disappeared right in front of him.
Wow.
And we thought, that's pretty right. There's another fellow was riding, 10 miles from there, and had a relatively new car, was riding down the road. All of a sudden, this 7-8 foot tall Bigfoot creature walks out in front of his vehicle, and the car motor begins to sputter. And the car engine almost goes dead, and as the creature walks off, everything comes back to normal. Well, those type of EM effects you've heard about with UFOs, but they've also been reported around the country with Bigfoot, but it's something very few people know about or very few people will discuss. And then as these events are continuing to unfold from across the state, and again, as we talked about, there was no internet back in those days, there were no cell phones, it was a whole different time frame, we began to see a pattern. For example, we would get a report of a UFO sighting or strange lights in a certain locale. Within minutes to hours to days later, we would have a Bigfoot sighting in that area, or vice versa. And then we began to have these amazing cases with Bigfoot and UFOs seen together at the same time and place. And now, first thing I have to stress here, which I try to explain to people, I am not suggesting a Bigfoot is an alien, because we don't know for sure what the UFOs represent. As you know, there's many theories, and I've said for years and years that I feel that there's more than one origin for the unknown category of UFO reports. So could some of these be extraterrestrial? Possibly. Could some of these be time travelers? Could some be unknown natural phenomena? Could some of these be, for a lack of a better term, interdimensional, which more and more I'm beginning to look at this as an explanation for a lot of strange cryptid and UFO cases, which we'll get into. And so we don't know what we're dealing with here. And I will tell you right from the beginning, I don't have the answers. I can only present what we've uncovered, and maybe someday we'll have an answer. But there's a lot of mysteries here that nobody really knows what we're dealing with.
Right. And that brings me to another question asked on the message board. If there is a cover-up of this evidence or whatever it is, what would anyone have to gain by dismissing the existence of cryptids like Bigfoot? Why would it be covered up if it is covered up? Or is it just plain unknown? What's your opinion on that?
A lot of the phenomena, I said years ago, the phenomena is so strange it protects itself.
Uh-huh.
And, while the research I've done here and the groups I had years ago, we had a lot of very good positive response with the news media, and I still get very good response in the media around here. But in many parts of the country, there's unfortunately a lot of ridicule with all these subjects still, with UFOs and Bigfoot and cryptids. So a lot of people, as you know, are still reluctant to report these type of things. But is there a cover-up? I think the phenomena itself, because the subject matter kind of protects itself because of the ridicule and takes away from serious research in some cases, which is unfortunate. But I can also tell you, and I write about some of these excuse me, I'm just getting over this terrible cold. Some of these cases I've written up my 3 books, and I go into detail about the fact that I've had incidents here in Pennsylvania. Some of them were extremely interesting Bigfoot and cryptid cases, which indicated that there was a good possibility that there were government agencies involved in investigating them and following up on those cases as well. And from what I can see, I do truly believe that the government has an interest both in UFOs and Bigfoot. And personally, I think they're still trying to determine exactly what they're dealing with themselves. My feeling is the reason there's a lot of government secrecy involved is because, one, they're not in control of what's happening out there, and two, they don't have all the answers themselves about UFOs or Bigfoot, and they're trying to figure out what's going on themselves.
Right. I kind of feel that I'm right there with you on that. I believe that as well. Someone wanted to know about the cryptid called, or some call it Moon Man. It comes out, or people have seen it only during a full moon, kind of like a werewolf. Has that happened in Pennsylvania at all? Anyone talk about a being that comes out only in the full moon?
Yeah, the Moon Man thing could be more of a local type, name that's given in many parts of the country, in Pennsylvania, all around the country. There's a lot of localized names given to Bigfoot and other creatures that are being reported. For example, back in the 60s, late 60s in this area, we were having a lot of sightings of a very tall Bigfoot creature covered with white hair, and we get reports of white ones every once in a while. We still do, and they called it the Lober Monster. So you get these localized names for some of these events. Now, in 73, as I recall, there was some interesting activity. It seemed to peak at times during the full moon. And but again, it's something that I have not seen commonly in a lot of the other reports, but it's come up in some reports over past years. But I'm not familiar with the moon creature you mentioned in particular, no.
Yeah, okay. So there was another question up here, but why, getting back to the possible cover-up, if there is a possible cover-up, the only reason a government would get involved, I would think, in something like this is because it's a puzzle, not only to everyone investigating it, but also to the government. And like I think you said earlier, it's something they can't control, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think it's that. But I also think the main thing is they want to learn whether it's a technology or what is common about these reports. And I think I may have gotten into it a little bit earlier, but again, something I found years ago, and I'm not sure I brought this up or not, but did we talk about the energy connection?
Nuh-uh. Nope, not yet.
Okay, well, anyhow, years ago, and this is still ongoing, many low-level, close-range UFO sightings and many close-range encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids commonly occur in the vicinity of energy sources. So many sightings occur around high-tension power lines, power plants, railroad tracks, reservoirs, radio communication towers, gas lines, gas wells. It goes on and on and on. That's something that's continually being reported. I believe for years that there's an energy connection to a lot of the phenomena we're dealing with. But also, and again, for a lack of a better term, I think a lot of the cryptids we're dealing with, and at least certain types of UFOs, are of an interdimensional source, that under certain conditions, and it seems to be that even though these things happen in widespread areas, there are certain areas where this happens more frequently, that they come into our physical reality, they look physically solid at times, they can leave physical evidence behind, but then they're gone. They come and they go. And we can get into some of the weird stuff I've uncovered. I know other researchers have looked into over the years. In fact, you probably know I do a lot of lecturing around the country on these subjects. And I'm working on a new program just talking about the strange aspects of the elusive Bigfoot and a lot of the very strange things that a lot of people don't know about or don't want to talk about with Bigfoot, which also suggests, again, that we might be dealing with something that's more than just a flesh and blood animal, as reluctant as I am to say it, but I've got to go where the evidence leads. And again, I don't have the answers. I can only present to you what we've uncovered.
Right. When you say more than a flesh and blood animal, I'm going to have to get more information. What do you mean by that statement? Okay,
I'm going to go back to some of the cases going back in the 70s when we began to see some of these incidents. And one case in particular, and which was really outstanding, and there were other similar reports going on as well. and this is in February of 1974. This is up in Fayette County again, way up in the mountains. The time period some of your listeners will recall because it was the time we had the big national trucker strike. There was violence going on across the highways in the country. There was gas rationing. You remember that?
Oh, yeah, I sure do. 1973. Yep.
Well, 73 and the 74.
Yep.
So this was February 6th of 1974. I remember it well because I wanted to get up to that location. I couldn't get up to that night because I couldn't get gas. And because there was violence on the highways at the time in Pennsylvania, the National Guard was patrolling with the state police. So you had some members of both the state police and the National Guard responded to this incident. And so what happened was, here's this woman who lived in the mountains all her life in this nice little cabin home. The woman had lived there forever, knew animals well, was a very good shot with her guns, and she was sitting there watching TV that night. Everything was normal. She began to hear a commotion on her little cabin front porch. She had some pop cans out there. Something was knocking the pop cans around. And she had a previous problem with a pack of wild dogs coming through. So she figured, well, the dogs are probably back. So she thought, you know what, I'll grab my shotgun. I'll just fire over her head and scare the dogs away. So she loads one chamber of her shotgun. And she proceeds to go over and turn the switch on the wall to turn the porch light on. She walks over to the front porch door, opens it up, steps out on the porch. There's no dogs, but only a few feet in front of her is this 7 to 8 foot tall, hairy Bigfoot type creature with his arms straight up over his head. And her first reaction is pull the trigger and shoot it, which is what she did. And she said there was this bright flash of light, like the flash on a camera, and it vanishes right in front of her. Now, 100 feet away, the in-laws lived. They heard the gunshot, and they called her, and she tried to tell them what happened. Her son-in-law grabbed his sidearm, a pistol. He began to walk up that dark road towards her house and saw a figure running down the road. And as he got closer, he said he's surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire, began to shoot at them, ran into the cabin home, and as they're looking outside over the woods, there's this large object, like a big Christmas ornament with different colored lights on it, hovering over the woods at the same time.
Boy,
she was pretty scared, and her son-in-law was pretty scared. They called the state police, and by the time they found her way up in the mountain, whatever there was gone. However, I talked to the primary investigating officer, and he said, I don't know what was going on up there, but there was something very, very strange. And that he based on the animal reactions when he arrived at the location. Now, that's something I have seen of some of my teams observed. You can fool people, you can't fool the animals. Very commonly with the Bigfoot reports, when animals are close to these creatures, they react very, very unusual, very frightened. This is in horses and cattle and cats, other animals, but very prominently with dogs. Even the most ferocious dogs, when they're close, they're just like petrified in fear. They won't bark. They don't move. Some people report them laying in their dog houses with their eyes moving around, and they won't bark or move. They cower, they cry. Sometimes they won't even eat right for 2 or 3 days later. Now, when I got up to the scene the next morning, everything was back to normal. I remember one trooper told me, he said, when he was there that night, I think it was an Eskimo Spitz, he said the dog was in its cage, it wouldn't make a sound, wouldn't move. He opened it up, and the dog should have ripped his arm off, and the dog wouldn't even move. Now, the next morning, everything was back to normal. And, in fact, when we got to the scene next morning, my team and I searched in the area. We met an animal officer from their county. He was up there looking with us. And out in the woods, we found the BB pattern from that shotgun in the tree directly in line from the porch where the lady shot at it. That was the case that convinced me, and there's a lot more to that story too, that we're dealing with something that's more than just a flesh and blood animal. There's something else going on here.
Wow. Now, has anyone ever reported being hurt by a Bigfoot?
You know, I can't recall any cases that I can confirm in Pennsylvania. Of the hundreds of witnesses I've interviewed in Pennsylvania who have reported these cases for many, many years, these things do not appear to be aggressive, at least the cases I've had. They seem to be very curious of human activity. Even in daylight, they've approached people at fairly close range. They're attracted to certain sounds, it seems, and we know they don't like loud sounds, and they don't like bright lights, but they seem to be very curious of people, but in all, generally, they don't appear to be aggressive, even in some cases where people shot at them, which I don't recommend, but I've had numerous cases over the years where people shot at them with different weapons, and I can go into some interesting cases for you if you like. Nobody ever brought one down. In a few cases, they fell down and got back up and moved away. But even in cases like that, they didn't really go after the person shooting at them.
Wow. Yeah. I think that's, it's almost like shooting at a human. I think it's kind of, I think that's kind of brutal that people, but I guess, out of fear, people will shoot. I guess that's probably what it's based. Now, go ahead.
Now, I was going to say the woman who shot at the creature where it disappeared, as many times I interviewed her, she never ever called it a Bigfoot. She said, "Oh, look, a great big hairy ape," is what she said to me.
Yeah. Now, what about films? I'm sure you probably have people send films. How come there isn't any really? There's the Patterson film, of course, that no one can seem to be able to debunk that. I know a lot of people have tried, but one of the things you hear skeptics say, how come there's no real, everyone has an iPhone on them, how come there's no really good either video or pictures of Bigfoot out there?
Okay, well, one, I can tell you a couple different variations of that. One, I do get various pictures. I've got game cam pictures that come in on occasion. We do get video on occasion, both of UFOs and cryptids. But unfortunately, while there's something on them, most of them, the detail is not good enough to really be sure of what you're looking at. I mean, I remember one video up on the ridge several years ago people took with their game cam, and you can see the side of something with very long hair on it, but you just can't be sure what it is. I mean, from where they were, what they claimed they saw and the height of this thing, it did not appear to be a bear, but you can't say 100% it wasn't a bear. And so you get things like that. The other thing is, a lot of the cameras, especially at nighttime, they're not designed to take photographs at night, especially digital cameras. So there's a lot of technical reasons why, especially with UFO sightings, a lot of them come out very distorted and they look completely different what people report. But even with some of the cryptid reports on occasion, people have tried to take pictures, even though it's very rare. The main problem I run into constantly from people who have encounters with these creatures is, one, they are so shocked seeing these things, and a lot of the incidents only last for seconds, that the last thing they ever thought about was taking a picture until after it was over.
I understand.
They're so shocked by what they're seeing. And I remember a case from, probably back in the 1980s, from a beautiful park, wooded area outside of Pittsburgh. And this was in daylight. This was a professional photographer. This was before digital cameras. He had a beautiful camera. It was a 35 millimeter with a long lens on it. He was out there that day taking pictures. And from what I remember him telling me, he's standing there, and all of a sudden, several deer come flying across the hill through the field in front of him. And right behind him, here's a 7 to 8 foot tall Bigfoot creature chasing after the deer. He said he was so shocked to see it, he didn't even think about raising his camera to take a picture at that time. And that's a very, very common thing. And then, to add to the mystery, another phenomena, and this is with both UFOs and some of the cryptid reports, and I remember some of these incidents going back to, again, at least the 1980s, is that this is an unusual thing. I can tell you, I've had cases in the last few years which more and more people from widespread areas unknown to each other are telling me the same thing. In some cases where we have low-level, close-range UFO sightings, and even people with Bigfoot and or other type of evidence associated with a cryptid, when they try to take a picture of it, their cameras will not technically work. They fail, and when they leave the scene or the phenomena is gone, the cameras are working as normal. But that's something we're hearing about more and more often.
Yeah, you have. Now, what about evidence as far as, like, we already talked about footprints. What about fur? any samples of fur, anything ever found on location where there was a sighting?
Yeah, fortunately and unfortunately, back during that wave of the 70s, we did have what we thought were some very good hair samples. But back in those days, there was no DNA testing. And as I recall, back at that time period, through another organization, we had access to two very well-known anthropologists at the time, and the samples were sent in to them. And from what I remember, and I have it written up in my Foul Invasion book what they found, but they were able to identify pretty much all the samples. One particular sample, which we felt was the most significant. There was a terrible smell to it. When you put it near a dog, the dogs would immediately respond to it. And we thought it was probably the most legitimate one. And from what I remember, they said it was so close to human, I can't remember exactly the wording, but they couldn't say for sure. And but unfortunately, back in those days when we sent them to a lab, it was destructive testing, so we lost all the samples. And we have none left, unfortunately.
Wow. Now, I know Dr. Melba Ketchum South down in the Kentucky area has, come to a conclusion with DNA testing that there's some type of relation to humans. Now, I know she's tried to publish, and she's had some issues. She's had threats. It's all pretty interesting. So the evidence now, like today, let's say if something happened now where there was fur found, in a sighting or in a footprint or whatever, you would handle that differently today, wouldn't you? You'd get that tested?
Yeah, unfortunately, back 70s, 80s, and 90s, I had a lot of contacts, a lot of labs, a lot of people in the science field. Unfortunately, many of those people are now deceased. A lot of those people retired. So I don't have the sources like I did, but I still do have some contacts out there. And if we're lucky enough to get any good samples, I'm sure we can find a way to get it analyzed.
Right. Now, something that comes up, and I mentioned it in the very beginning, is how come no one's ever found... Now, people have claimed to have found them sleeping, and there's some films of that. I don't know if they're, I can't tell. It's really anything on YouTube I kind of disregard anyway. But what about a body? People are always asking, why aren't there any remains? Are you thinking that they're along the lines of they're possibly interdimensional? And if so, before you answer that, does that mean they would have like the full weight of gravity in this dimension as they would? Or isn't there some cases where people say that they've seen something floating or something like that?
There's all kinds of strange reports out there I've looked into over the years. And, my latest book, Astonishing Encounters, gets into all kind of cryptid reports and weird stuff. And, some of the Bigfoot reports over the years, while some people said they look like, physically solid creatures, there were some cases, for example, we looked into where they can only see parts of the body, or some people reported some type of effect around the body, so some type of energy effect, or something glowing around them at times. There's so many weird things. Sometimes disappearing again in a flash of light. The disappearing tracks. There was so many aspects of these things that some people reported these things moved in almost like slow motion or mechanically. Some talked about, I was trying to think of that, they were encompassed like a mist of some type. And it's not just with Bigfoot. It's a lot of these other reports we're getting. Another phenomenon here in Pennsylvania are the Black Panther sightings. And they've been going on for years and years, and you may call it more of an out-of-place animal because, of course, what we would think of as a black jaguar, black leopard, of course, never scientifically was in this part of the country. But people have seen them in Pennsylvania and many other parts of the country for years and years. Hunters see them almost every year. And there's some interesting aspects of that a lot of people don't know. For example, sometimes when you have a localized Bigfoot outbreak, and this is another part of the phenomenon, you get these Bigfoot sightings, you get sporadic reports, but then you get some of these cases over the years, and not just in Pennsylvania, but other parts of the country, even other countries, where the phenomena seems to focus on a certain small geographic area, certain people, where they have all kind of phenomena break out, could be days, weeks, or months on their property, where they begin to have screams and cries and see footprints, they see Bigfoot, they see strange lights, they have other paranormal phenomena occur, and then it's gone. But in some of these cases over the years, when we've had, for example, I remember one outbreak back in the 1980s in a part of Westmoreland County where many people in this area for weeks and weeks were seeing Bigfoot and UFOs or whatever. But also at the same time, there was an outbreak of Black Panther sightings in the area as well. And another phenomenon that on occasion I hear this, and I know it's been reported in other states, sometimes a cryptid such as Bigfoot is seen in conjunction with another cryptid of a different type. So there have been reports, I understand, of Bigfoot and Black Panthers being seen, and I've had reports of Bigfoot and other strange cryptids being seen together. It's a much more unusual phenomenon than any of us really understand, and it's something that's not talked about hardly ever.
Wow, interesting. Now, I know you are mentioning that you're following, you kind of follow what's going on other states just to see if there's, any commonalities. The one thing I want to talk about is you always hear that there's an odor, a really strong odor. Do you have cases where people talk about that?
I've had many, many reports of people describe this terrible smell like rotten eggs, sulfur, something that's been dead for a long time. However, it is not apparent in all reports. Sometimes there's no odor whatsoever. My theory for years has been that the odor has something to do with the process of these things coming into our physical reality. And that's just a theory, of course. But I can tell you I did smell it. And I can go back pre-outbreak. I remember, again, out in Derry Township, I remember one of the local police chiefs calling me about an incident where two people were involved in an incident that happened out in that area. It was, I believe, in August of 73, I'm sure it was, and the woman involved, it was a warm night, and she was moving around in bed and had the feeling somebody was watching her. She turned around, and there's the window, only a few feet away from her bed. This thing was looking in the window, crouched down, and pulled the drapes back, was looking directly at her. She described in great detail the face of this thing, and what was odd was, as this thing moved back from the window, 9 feet off the ground, she could hear barely any sound. A short time later, her daughter on the other side of the house started screaming and yelling that she just saw the biggest shadow she had ever seen, and just about that time, that terrible odor and actually spread into her home. 3 days later, when I went down with the police chief to interview the women, you could still smell that rotten odor in the house.
Yeah. Wow. So, what I want to actually change gears a little bit here, and talk about some of the strange cryptids. Besides, you talk about the possible panthers or whatever they are. But what are some of the other strange animals that people are seeing in the state? Okay.
And remind me, however, to tell you a panther report, which is going to give you a whole different perspective again on what we're dealing with. One of the other reports we get a lot of sightings on more and more in recent years, but they've been going on for a long time, are the sightings of the thunderbirds. And the thunderbirds basically is a term for these very huge, generally dark brown or black, huge birds with massive wingspans. We're talking like a small aircraft, like a Piper Cub. So we're talking 10 to over 20 foot wide. And just like with UFO sightings, it's very difficult to judge altitude and size. But with some of the Thunderbird reports, they are extremely close to witnesses, and in some cases they were on the ground. For example, they were blocking the roadway, eating animal or roadkill, so people were looking at these things face to face and got a really good idea of how big they were. One case, now this was in neighboring West Virginia, back several years ago in 2007, and this fellow was early morning, was riding down the road, a two-lane country road, and all of a sudden he had to hit his brakes because here's this huge, gigantic bird standing there in the road eating roadkill, and he said that the top of the thing was standing up was at least 4 feet tall because it was taller than the liner of his vehicle, and it stared at him. He stared at it. They kept watching each other. This thing kept flapping its huge wings, kind of hopping on its legs, trying to get off the ground, but it was so heavy he could barely get off the ground. And he said his eyes were concentrating on the wingtips of the animal because it was so amazing. He said it's flapping its wings. You can see the dust and dirt going up off the road as it's trying to get off the ground, and finally it did. And he went back the next day and measured the width of the road. It was 21 feet across.
21 feet. Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And I have numerous other reports. Now, here's the interesting thing. While I put these under the topics of the Thunderbird reports, there are similarities yet differences. And again, it's another whole phenomena because people keep reporting these things. One, some of these just look like huge oversized birds, like that report. Some people are reporting seeing these things that are completely covered with leathery skin with no feathers. They look more like huge giant bats. In some cases, people are reluctant to even tell me. They're reluctant to tell me about the other reports, too, but that these things look like pterodactyls or teratorns, like prehistoric birds, that they've given me great details about. And there have been some sightings of these at close range, even in daylight. And then there's some people who even say they look like gargoyles. So there's differences but similarities in these reports as well.
Wow. Now, I know this is all speculation, but if these things are all like coming in from another dimension, let's just say, throw that out there. I have no idea. Would there be some type of portal like you hear about, like on the Skinwalker Ranch, there's that great story about this thing coming out of what looked like a portal. I mean, how would they appear and how would they go away? You mentioned gone in a flash of light, but it seems like it would almost be like an intelligence, like highly intelligent, to be able to cross dimensions. I mean, it just keeps
again,
down the rabbit hole here.
Yeah, we just don't know. Again, we have that definite energy connection to a lot of these sightings. So I know there's some kind of energy related to these type of reports going on. Over the years, on occasion, up on the Chestnut Ridge, for example, there's people up there who claim, going back years and years, they've seen some type of a vortex, some kind of energy source. Sometimes it appears when these things are in the area or appear. It's not that common. I have those kind of reports. Sometimes these things just seem to appear and disappear. It's very, very strange phenomena. And something I noticed with various cryptid cases, and some of these cases are just incredibly amazing. And some of them are extremely detailed reports. But one thing that came up a number of times from different witnesses who have been very, very close to these type of creatures, they talk about the fact that when they're watching the creatures, and all of a sudden the creatures turn and look at the witnesses right directly in their face, and the creatures appear to be unusually startled, as though, how are you able to see me? That's something that people bring up on a number. This has been with various cryptids, as though all of a sudden they're caught and think they can't be seen, but they are being seen. And I think that's very fascinating.
That's very much what Paul Eno was on, and basically said something very similar to that. Actually, with ghosts, he said, like, we actually crossed into their world, possibly, because of people looking shocked, or so that's really interesting. You kind of are saying something very similar to what he did.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but there's been all kind of creature sightings. There's the giant birds, the black panthers, and just to tell you about this one case, because I always thought this was such a fascinating report. It's among others we've heard, but up years ago, back in the 80s, up in Fayette County again, we went up to interview a witness who lived out in the rural area of Fayette County, February of '83, and the guy just got home about 1 o'clock in the morning, and his car was overheating. So he pulled in the driveway, decided to get some antifreeze out of the garage. So he opens up the hood of the car, and he hears a growl. and he turns around and looks and hears a growl coming from what looks like a pretty good-sized tomcat, black tomcat, and it's about 20 feet away from him, and he didn't pay a lot of attention to it, so he goes back to work on the car. A few seconds later, he hears his second growl, but this time the growl sound is much deeper and much louder, and he was shocked that when he went to look at that cat, that was first a large house cat, but now it had physically grown in size to be about a foot bigger in body length. So he reacted by throwing the antifreeze jug at it, and the large cat growled fiercely at him like it was going to attack. It took a few steps backwards and growled again and began to move up the illuminated road. And the witness ran inside his garage and grabbed his pistol and took a shot at it, but he wasn't sure if he hit it. He said at that point, that animal appeared to have physically grown to the size of a black panther like you would see in a zoo. And he said it was solid black with very apparent yellow glowing eyes. The body was about 2 to 3 feet long, and the tail itself was about the same length, swishing around. And he said as it walked up the road right in front of him, it suddenly disappeared right into thin air and was gone.
Oh, unreal. Wow.
And that's the kind of reports we're getting from different people of different cryptids. It's just amazing what's going on. We've had what people would call dragon reports in the last several years, and the one case up in Fayette County was very detailed. We had one, I think, like 3 years ago near Jeanette and Penn. We had 2 reports a day apart from witnesses, and that case, that second day, the people said it looked like the way it flapped its dark wings in the distance, it looked like a dragon. They were reluctant to say it. The interesting thing was it was following and circling a helicopter. That was the second report I had in several years where these giant birds were circling around helicopters for some reason.
Wow. Someone wanted to know on the message board what about the Fayette County dog man. Is that something you've looked into? Well,
the dogman reports, we've been hearing reports on these things now for many years. I should say, in the last few years, you're hearing more and more reports of them. I understand there are investigative societies in eastern PA in recent months, and I know they had a number of cases last year in Pennsylvania. So these dogmen reports, they're kind of interesting in that, is it another cryptid? Is it another variation of Bigfoot? Because these things are generally, they quite often walk on all fours, but sometimes get up and walk on their hind legs and walk upright like Bigfoot does. But they generally have a pronounced snout. Quite often they have luminous, glowing eyes. And those who have seen them at very close range, they have prominent fang-like teeth. But the face is much more wolf-like. Now, I think the case that may have been talking about, and bear with me, my voice is going a little bit with this cold I had. Back in 2009, up in Fayette County, outside of Uniontown, I was up there with a team from the Pennsylvania Bigfoot Society, and I was up there with them. This was a beautiful afternoon, July 10th of 2009, and this woman's riding down this main highway about 30 miles an hour around 6 o'clock in the afternoon, as I recall, and all of a sudden she catches out of the left side of the vehicle, left corner of her eye, what appears to be a person is going to walk out right in front of her car. So she swerves to miss hitting the person, but as she looks up, she realizes this is not a human, that this thing is an upright creature about 6 feet tall, and that it's covered with long hair, at least 6 feet tall, had dark-colored hair covering the body of the man-like creature. The head was described as large, elongated, and covered in hair that looked very wild. Its neck was rather odd-looking, and she said that actually the face and head was much more like a wolf. She also mentioned, as I recall, it had very large, black, ferocious-looking eyes. And she pulled over to the curb. She was so shook up. She looked in the rearview mirror, and this thing had actually leaped over the trunk of the car. And interestingly, when we went up to look at it, I was examining the car, and I found these very unusual brush marks in the paint on the back of the car. They had never seen them before, so it looks like the thing may have brushed the paint as it hopped over. Then the next thing she knew, she was sitting there, and about 75 feet away, it was running down the road towards what they would call Jamonville, which is an area which has a lot of history of Bigfoot sightings in the area. So her sighting may fall under more of a dogman report, and they're seeing these things all over the country. Now, I have never had any reports where people have seen tails, but I understand there may be some reports where people claim to have seen tails. I have not had any of that in any of the cases I've looked into. Going back into '73 with all those Bigfoot sightings, as I read the dogmen reports, I'm going back to 1973, and I'm recounting how the fact is that we had some very strange Bigfoot reports, odd ones. Most of those reports during that time were of your typical Bigfoot report, something 7 to 9 feet tall, generally no neck, very long arms, but there were some variations. Some were smaller, some were thinner, some were more muscular. But then there was that series of reports that would fall more along the line of some of the dogmen reports. And I remember one case in particular, and it's got an odd aspect to it. Again, it's another one of these aspects of the cases that you don't hear about very often. But this occurred between Greensburg and Jeanette in Westmoreland County, August 28th, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sure on your talk shows you'll find that a lot of paranormal and a lot of strange encounters occur around 3 o'clock in the morning. That's something we've noticed over the years. But here was a woman who was visiting some friends in this very rural area. The home that they were in was a very low foundation to the ground. She went into the bathroom. She was sitting there when she began to hear these strange sounds from outside the window, and all of a sudden, right in front of her, we're talking 3 feet away, directly in front of her, this hideous face rises up and is looking directly in the window, directly at her face. And she went into great detail, and she talked about the glowing eyes, the pointed ears, the ape-like nose, and the very large fang-like teeth. And this thing was looking right at her. She ran out of there. She was hysterical. They called the state police. The state police hooked her in to talk to me. I interviewed her within minutes after she saw it. State trooper went out to the scene immediately, found some possible tracks there. She was so scared she made those people take her to her home several miles away. Interestingly, within the hour, the same or another creature showed up on her property.
Wow.
Now, that's something you don't hear about very often, but there have been other cases of that going on as well.
Yeah. Now, are there some people that do claim, excuse me, that there's repeated visits? You mentioned these whatever they were, Bigfoot or whatever, that came up to this cabin. Are there some places that they frequent? Do you hear anything like that?
Yeah, there are, and that's what we were talking about earlier, that it seems in certain cases, now most reports are random sightings, but then over the years, we have some cases where this phenomena seems to focus on a small geographical area. Sometimes it's just maybe a few acres on somebody's farm, or it could be within a couple of miles, and many people over a period of weeks and months reporting encounters with Bigfoot, strange lights, UFOs, other creatures. On some farms during the 70s, these things repeatedly were supposedly coming back on certain farms, and we staked some of those farms out. And one of my investigators was there one night when he heard this thing screaming, saw a UFO in the sky. It was very, very, it was quite an experience for him. And I remember when I was out on that farm interviewing those people that one thing that they had brought up, and this was back before we realized what was going on with all these other reports, they would say they would hear these creatures screaming, crying sounds. They would see it on their property, and within minutes later, they would see strange lights or strange objects hovering around the farm right after they were seeing the creature. So that kind of thing has gone on, and there have been some repeat activity on certain locations, but it's not as common as just the case where these things are seen on a one-time occurrence.
Right. Now, is there a question up on the message board? Is there any connection between the cryptids and the Adirondack Mountains? Is there a lot of sightings through the mountains?
Well, we got a lot of, not particularly Adirondacks, but we got lots of reports around mountainous areas in Pennsylvania, a lot of the forest areas of Pennsylvania. Again, the Chestnut Ridge, that mountain range is 100 miles long. It goes from Preston County, West Virginia, to Westmoreland, Fayette, Indiana County. That's very active year after year with reports. We've had some activity already being reported this year, a lot of reports last year. We didn't even talk about some of the sightings that happened last year, which were very interesting. And but you do get a lot of reports. And I think earlier somebody had called in and wanted to know about these things sleeping. And I can only recall one case years ago where somebody claimed they saw one sleeping on a bed of hay. But there have been some very big areas that I have seen over the years where Bigfoot was being reported in certain areas, and these were much, much bigger than a deer lay, much more unusual. But during all this activity in the 70s, when people were seeing these creatures, if there were caves or mines in the area, we went into many of those caves and mines, searched for evidence, and found no evidence that they were staying in there, for example.
Wow. What about food? Do they ever, is there any cases of them stealing food?
Yes. That's something we did uncover long ago. We knew they liked apples, corn, and berries. I remember one case that was really interesting back during the outbreak in '73, because we had a call from the state police in Indiana County to send up a team because they had a report of a Bigfoot being shot, and they thought there was a possibility there was blood on the roadway. So we got up to Indiana County. People had like a big apple orchard. They had just picked a bunch of these beautiful big apples and had a number of bushel baskets full of apples, and this Bigfoot came right up on their porch. So it's like 20-some feet away. They're watching this thing. It's popping whole apples in its mouth at one time. And it goes around to the side of the house, and the kid in the house grabs his rifle. He looks out the side window, and the thing's looking in the window directly at him. It continues to walk across the front towards the road. He goes out on the porch, and this thing's chewing an apple, going across the road, and the kid waits until it was in a safe area where there's no homes around, began shooting at the creature. It kept walking with no indication it was being wounded whatsoever, but it went into the woods, let out those tremendous screams, and other people came outside, and they called the state police, because on the road it appeared to be some splotches of blood. When the state police got there, they got there before we did, they picked up the apple samples and took it back apparently to the lab, but they left the blood samples for us, and we sent it off to an anthropologist, and the best they could come up with was that, one, it was not blood, it was apple juice mixed with saliva. That's the best they could come up with.
Jeez. Wow, that's bizarre. You heard, we talked, or mentioned something about the Skinwalker Ranch, some similarities, and, they shot at some, these oversized, like, wolves there, and there was absolutely nothing, no blood, no nothing. Same type of thing. This is just such a strange phenomena. And what about some of these? I heard there was some type of weird, like standing deer type of cryptid scene.
Yeah, and actually a lot of the information I published on these cases back in the '70s, there was a lot of similarities to the Skinwalker Ranch reports. There was a lot of similar phenomena. And ever since that time, once again, there are other places in the country, and some of these are cases where the public doesn't even know about. But I was called into some incidents over the last few years of families where this phenomena seems to be concentrating on them, and other investigators are looking into some of these cases now. And I know of one case that's still active down in eastern Pennsylvania where apparently some of this it's been ongoing even in recent weeks and months. And you asked about, I think, the creature case you're talking about. There are so many reports. We had the flying humanoid sighting, the winged humanoid sighting up in Butler County a few years ago. But this was interesting, and we've had other reports of floating entities, small humanoid creatures that float across the surface of the roadways. But this one's really odd because it's completely different than most people have heard of. The witness has no idea what she saw. It's a very credible person. I've interviewed this person actually in person a number of times. And this was in late August or first week of September of 2015, so it wasn't that long ago, in the eastern part of Butler County, north of Pittsburgh, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a sunny day. Whitson was taking a leisurely ride, and she was looking around at a stream or to the right of the vehicle, when suddenly about 15 to 20 feet ahead of her, and about three-quarters of the way across the road, the witness sees something that she found it very hard to try to figure out what it was. First thought was it was a deer. Then realized it was something unlike she had ever seen before. That's because the first feature caught her eye is that the head looked similar to a deer. The head was angled straight up, but the head was not real pointy, and it was narrowed at the top and then rounded off. The body was similar in color to a deer, and it was very thin. It stood about 4 to 4.5 feet tall, and the body appeared smooth, did not have any apparent hair on it. Now, the being was only observed from the side, had never looked towards the car. They never saw any detail of the face. The arms looked to be very short, out of proportion to the rest of the body, and the arms were held in very close to the chest area. But the hands were very small and gave the impression that they were being held together or possibly holding something. What the witness found hard to explain was that it appeared to be something hanging down, possibly some type of fabric that was covering around the leg area, but no legs or feet were observed. And the driver stated that the being just glided above the road, and even stranger was that behind the head there was an odd effect. According to the witness, it looked sort of like a time-lapse picture, like a cartoon when the character is moving so fast the body can't keep up with it. And the witness stated it looked like the head portion was losing streaks of body matter as it glided across the road. Within a few seconds, she approached that area, and there was not anywhere to be seen again in the area.
Wow, that is really, really bizarre.
And
Go ahead.
And the reports just go on and on and on. There's so many weird reports coming in from so many different people. There was a family up near Ligonier about 2 years ago in the afternoon, and they see this fox-like creature, as I recall, in broad daylight. They can see the complete solid outline of the body, but it's completely transparent, and they can see like energy matter within the body itself as it walked right in front of, trotted in front of their car, went off into the woods and disappeared.
Jeez. Do people ever report these things and like they're having they're really hesitant to report at all? And as a matter of fact, they wait a long time and before they actually do the report?
All the time. That's very common. I get calls in here almost every day, either emails or reports. And I have so many people that are so reluctant to call me about it. First thing they say to me is, don't use my name, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but this is what I saw. I want to know if anybody else has ever seen it like this or in my area, if anybody else reported it. Very, very common. And let me tell you, to a lot of these witnesses, it's a life-changing experience because they can't believe they saw something that's not supposed to exist. And, there's some witnesses that I'm in touch with from 20, 30 years ago, and they still can't deal with it.
Wow.
I mean, I remember one fella, he was with another witness working on a road crew back, probably 30-some years ago in daylight. They watched two Bigfoot creatures across the field from where they were working. They were bending down. They appeared to have deer carcasses over the shoulder of these things. They were standing right next to some farm machinery, so that we could get a really good idea from the distance and how high it was and how tall these things were. And these things were huge and massive. And I mean, that guy, and they never reported it. We heard word of mouth, and they had told some friends about it, and we followed up and we found the guys. But they wouldn't even have reported it. That's very, very common. The stranger the report is, the more unlikely the people are to talk about it publicly. Right.
And also, I also believe the more reluctant people are to talk about it, the more validity a sighting has.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the details they give us, I mean, I've talked to witnesses in the last year who have seen things that, again, nobody's ever reported before. And they're so reluctant to even tell me or tell anybody about these things. And I had a witness I interviewed last week. He called me. It's a businessman. I did some interviews with him. And this just happened last year, among other reports, but there were a lot of reports last year. He didn't report this. This was down in a county probably 20-some miles outside of Pittsburgh. And he was out one night walking along the railroad tracks, and he had a 1,000 lumen searchlight with him, so it's a very, very high-powered light, and he's projecting it around, looking around, and on the railroad tracks, remember we're talking about the energy connection, on the railroad tracks, which is close to a big creek area, his flashlight, he was in the car, he was in the car shining it over that area, looking around, and it hit this creature, this Bigfoot creature, which he just could not believe what he saw. And gave a very detailed description of what this creature looked like. Couldn't see the facial features on it, but the way it moved, the way it squatted, leaped over the tracks. He said it leaped over these tracks in one jump into the brush, and it was a huge, huge jump, unlike that of any human. And he knew what he saw, but like he said, he's just reluctant to tell a lot of people about it.
Wow. Now, what about railroad tracks? There's a place called the Bridgewater Triangle goes through Massachusetts and I think the northern Connecticut area, about a 200-mile triangle, and there's some tracks down there that there's a lot of like orb sightings and stuff like that, strange sightings. And what do railroad tracks have to do with
I'm aware of the area. I haven't investigated personally. I know other researchers over the years have been up there and up in that area who have investigated, but the orb reports are very intriguing. And this is going on more and more. I don't remember if I brought this up or not, but a lot of the people in the UFO field historically do not want to associate UFOs and Bigfoot. And many Bigfoot researchers, of course, don't want to associate Bigfoot with UFOs because they believe there's some type of unknown animal. Well, my position is I only document, and I'm talking about the case I investigated. I don't have the answers, but I'm not going to brush it under the rug and pretend these reports are not happening. I'm out there trying to find an answer, and I'm hoping to encourage other researchers and witnesses to talk about these reports. And I can tell you, in more recent years, I'm hearing more of these reports and more people in the Bigfoot community beginning to ask the same questions that I am. Why don't we have a body by now? And many of those people have these type of reports, but they've been reluctant to publish them or talk about them. I remember several years ago, I spoke out in McMinnville, Oregon at a UFO conference there, and I talked about the subject, which, of course, that's a heavy Bigfoot area, and I was amazed at the response I got because I figured there'd be a lot of negativity. There was none, and I had witnesses contact me later, researchers. I remember researchers contacting me and saying, we are so glad that you brought that up because we've had the same things out here. We've had cases of tracks that disappear, people shooting at them, and they disappear. The same kind of reports are going on all over the country, but you hear so little about it. And these orb reports are interesting because I'm hearing more from Bigfoot researchers who are out in Pennsylvania searching areas which have a history for Bigfoot sightings. Instead of seeing Bigfoot, they're seeing strange lights and strange objects close to the ground. And this just happened last year, right after a very intriguing Bigfoot sighting that I'll be glad to tell you about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, there were a number of really interesting Bigfoot sightings last year in different areas, but again, up in Fayette County, this was May the 10th, from memory, I believe it was May the 10th. Actually, my associate researcher, Jim Brown, investigated the case. These were two men riding down a very rural road up in the mountain, very heavy pouring down rain at the time, and all of a sudden this huge hairy Bigfoot creature comes down, I believe, the left side of the road, comes down over the embankment, or comes out onto the roadway about 20 feet in front of them and stands right in the middle of the road looking at them. So they're looking at it, it's looking at them. They both get a good look at each other. They can't believe what they're seeing. At one point, they back the car back a little bit, then gradually move the car up towards the creature and very slightly bump against it, and they have the bumper against the knee of the creature, and it turns around and puts its hand on the front of the car, then it goes down the road and disappears from sight. And there have been many other sightings in that area. There were some last year, many historically in that area. So I believe it was about a week later that a number of the Bigfoot researchers in the area went up to search that area because there had been a history of Bigfoot sightings up there. They did not see any Bigfoot, but many of them on the scene reported seeing these globes and orbs of light moving around the trees at low level or close range.
Wow. That is strange. So, when you were talking about these other strange animals, we talked about these panther-like things, uh, and were there have people tracked also them? I know they wouldn't leave impressions like, say, a Bigfoot, a 500-pound Bigfoot, or whatever whatever they weigh. But do people also check tracks for other cryptid sightings they see?
Oh yeah, on occasion they do. Well, I'll give you a good example on a really fascinating Black Panther incident that happened right in the suburb of Pittsburgh. A very major populated area. I believe it was 1983. This was in the Bloomfield section of Pittsburgh, and this made a lot of news at the time, by the way. And there's a large wooded area close by, and there was a big auto dealership in that area at the time. And there was a fence separating the woods from the dealership. Well, the mechanic that morning was putting a headlight on a car when this huge black panther dives over the fence from the woods, dives over a car, and lands a few feet away from him with a dead animal in its mouth. It's so close to him, he can see the fang-like teeth. He can smell it. He can hear it growling and breathing. The thing turns and looks at him, jumps back over the fence, goes back into the woods. Well, several people saw that one and a smaller one together. That led to a massive search by the Pittsburgh police and animal protectors with tranquilizer guns, and they searched and searched for a long time. In fact, one of my guys in my group was a special forces. He was a professional tracker. He went out there and did some tracking as well. They only were able to follow the tracks for a short distance, never found it, never saw it again. There was nothing missing from the zoos. And it's another one of those cases where did it go? Where did it come from?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was just thinking about this. Funny you said nothing missing from the zoos. Has is that often speculation when people see strange, animals that shouldn't be there, like panthers?
Oh yeah, of course, and that's one of the first things that, if the authorities are involved or we hear a report. It's, first of all, there's not a lot of these animals in captivity around here, and two, it's very rare that these things would ever escape. So we always check those reports out.
I see. Yeah. Okay, so we're getting near the end here. I wanted to ask you, what would you consider the strangest report? I mean, we've already talked about some really strange things, but what would you consider in all your years that you did this? And I don't care if it involves UFOs or whatever. What is the strangest thing that comes to mind?
Well, the case that always stands out among the thousands of cases I've looked into, it was that event that happened during that 73 Bigfoot UFO outbreak. It happened outside of Uniontown, PA, in Fayette County, October 25th of 1973. I'll tell you the basics of the story. It's one of the strangest cases on record. I have the whole thing detailed in my Silent Invasion book, which goes into great detail about it. But that evening, about 10:30 p.m., I got a call from a state trooper from the Uniontown Barracks. He had just came back from investigating this multiple witness UFO landing, and he felt that there was something probably still up in the pasture. He wanted me to get a team up in that area as soon as we could. Well, it's already late at night, but we did. We assembled a team. We got our radiation equipment, our other equipment together, found our way up to Fayette County. What happened was about 9 o'clock that evening, in this rural area, about 15 people, they observed this barn-sized red ball about 100 feet off the ground, and it's slowly moving towards the ground, towards the pasture. The farmer's son was coming out to visit his father, was on his dad's property. This was going on. He sees it as he's coming down the farm lane, and he goes up to a neighbor's house to get a better view, and it looks like it's going to land in his dad's pasture, so he and two young boys decide they're going to go up to investigate. So he stops over to his dad's farm. He grabs a 30-06 and a handful of ammunition. As they're riding down the road, they hear baby crying sounds in the distance, a loud whirling sound, and the dogs are going crazy all around the area. They finally make their way up to the top of the pasture, and when they get on top of there and they're looking over to the pasture, they can't believe what they're seeing because the object is on the ground or right above it. And now it's a bright white dome about 100 feet in diameter. It's not a complete sphere. And it's making this loud whirling noise, illuminating the whole area. and they're watching this thing, and they're trying to figure out what is this thing. And then 75 feet away is a barbed wire fence, and they're looking at the barbed wire fence because here's these two tall creatures walking in the direction very slowly. The one in the front is about 8 feet tall, and the one behind is a little smaller, around 7 feet tall. They're bipedal. They're your typical Bigfoot creature with covered long, dark, matted hair. There's no neck. The arms are so long, they're almost down to the ground. They're moving very stiffly, one behind the other. They have large, glowing green eyes. They're making this loud baby crying sound, and there's a smell like burning rubber in the air. So these things are getting closer and closer, and the one kid yells at the guy, shoot him, shoot him. Well, in that handful of ammunition he had got for his 30-06, there were two tracers. If you're a hunter, you know you just get that luminous trail. So anyhow, he fires that first tracer. There's no effect. He fires the second tracer, and the largest of the two creatures at that point lets out this very large crying sound, reaches out as though to grab at that tracer, and the object in the field disappears. It didn't take off. It just vanishes. And when it does, the sound stops, and most of the luminosity disappears. At that point, the guy starts firing live ammo into them. And he's mainly concentrated on the biggest creature, and he always told me for years before he passed away, he would never forget how that huge creature with those glowing green eyes just kept staring at him as he's pumping a lot of ammo into it with no effect on him whatsoever. The creatures keep walking into the woods. These guys are scared. They run back to the truck. They go to the farmhouse, take the family out of there, take them to a neighbor's, and call the state police. When the trooper arrived 45 minutes later, they went up in the patrol car. They're looking around up in the field where everything happened. The trooper told me the area where the object was on the ground was now self-luminescent and glowing, but 100 feet or more in diameter. He said if he had a newspaper, he could have read the newspaper from the light coming off the glowing area. He aimed his flashlight beam into it. You could barely see the beam. The farm animals wouldn't go anywhere near it. And we don't have enough time to get into the whole story. It gets weirder and weirder. They went back to the state police barracks. Both the trooper and the witness were taken to two separate rooms, and they were interviewed. Then they called me to send my team up. And it was the case that for my team and I, we began to realize that the Bigfoot phenomena was much more complex and much more unusual than any of us had any idea what we were dealing with.
Wow. Did the two separate interviews, did they collaborate each other perfectly?
Oh, yeah. Well, you mean with the state trooper and the witness?
Yeah.
Oh, sure they did. Yeah, and that's when they were told to contact me to send the team up.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting stuff. Stan, this has been great. I'll have to have you back on again to talk about more of this. And with the thousands of cases that you've investigated, I know there's a lot more where this came from. So can you tell the listener out there how they would find your website and books and all that?
Yeah, well, the website, it's stangordon.info, I-N-F-O. Email, if they want to email me, is at paufo@comcast.net. And my 3 books are available. The newest book is Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures, gets into all kind of bizarre cryptid cases, things we never even got into tonight. The Silent Invasion book has been very popular. It's about that massive wave of 73 and 74. Some of the weirdest things you ever read about are in that book with Bigfoot and UFOs. And my first book is Really Mysterious Pennsylvania. They're available on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or they can get autographed copies on my website as well.
Great. Oh, autographed copies. Great. Excellent. Stan, hey, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on. It was always fun.
All right. And I'll talk to you soon. Okay.
All right, good night.
Good night. So, everyone, thank you so much for listening. And we are going to be back next week. Next week, I'm doing kind of a different show. It's with a good friend of mine, Paul Gilmartin. He's a comedian. He was, you might, if anyone ever watched Dinner and a Movie, he was featured on that for 16 years on TBS. He's got a great story, and it'll be interesting to have him on next week. So thanks again for watching and listening to the show this evening. And I'm going to close this by the music that we play for the intro. The music for the outro is the full song, and it's called Blue Shadows, and that's by Mark Stanley. Now, Mark Stanley is going to be on our show, too, in May sometime. he has quite a story to tell. He's not just a guitarist. So Mark Stanley, look for him coming up, and I'll close with his music right here.
You'll find her in the blue shadows. When the sun is gone, she dances with the moon. I watch her by the fire, coolness of the night. I feel my desire rising with a light. I died in her arms and I'd live in her eyes, and I'd love her 1,000 times before the sun began to rise. You'll find her in the blue shadows. When the sun is gone, she dances with the moon. Like the wind of the river, she moves through the grass. So much I would give her if only she would ask. It's what she never says, it's the unopened door that makes me watch and wonder, makes me want her more. In the blue shadows, in the blue shadows, when the sun is gone, she dances with the moon.